We are extremely pleased to support the Centre for Cross-Border Studies in hosting this event with so many key stakeholders taking part. Our unique location in the northwest, a cross-border city and region, means we're acutely aware of the needs for a regionally balanced approach, improving our connectivity to, from and within the island. With 40% of our passengers coming from Donegal, we serve the wider northwest region in the truest sense. The wider economic benefits of such connectivity are very clear, with a key infrastructure like airports playing a pivotal role in our growth plans, particularly in an emerging region like the northwest of Ireland.
We bought a drink to take it off the bill. Una and her went round the town. Where we're going? The merchant.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm David Sterling, and I will be chairing this next session, which will be looking at testing the health of conditions for post-Brexit cooperation. I'm delighted that I'm joined this morning by four speakers. We have Professor Bridget Laffan, who is online with us. Bridget was recently a professor at the European University Institute. Delighted that we have got Minister Nicola Mallon, who is our Minister for Infrastructure. Very grateful that she has taken some time out of her very busy schedule to be with us this morning. Also delighted in the room we have Professor Pete Shirlow from the Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool. And lastly, but by no means least, we have Jess Sargent from the Institute for Government, and Jess will be speaking to us online as well. They did try to get Mark Carruthers, but sadly he wasn't available, but he has lent me his tie, so hopefully that will set us up rightly for the morning. I'm going to start. Each of the speakers will have around about no more than 8 minutes to speak. We'll take a few questions. I have a few questions as well, but please use the chat facility to send in your questions, and we'll try and get a good conversation going. So if that's all clear, I would turn firstly then to Professor Bridget Laffan to give us her talk. Bridget.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion this morning. I am sorry that I'm still on Zoom, but I'm trying to reduce my environmental imprint, but also I want to travel as little as possible, having spent far too much of my life traveling. I listened very attentively to what Madeleine Alessandri was talking about when she emphasized that relationships were the most important element of cooperation. And although I agree with her that relationships and human interaction is absolutely central, I think it doesn't pay sufficient attention to what I would call structural features. So if I take the analogy of the cake, it very much, the shape of the cake depends on the kind of tin that you use to bake it. So in other words, a rectangular cake tin will deliver a rectangular cake, a circular cake tin will deliver a circular cake, a floated cake tin will deliver one that has a very pretty hole in the middle. So in other words, we must begin from the premise, in my view, that the structural features of relations within the island of Ireland, between the United Kingdom and Ireland, and with the EU, have been fundamentally altered by Brexit. That Brexit is a rupture, has impacted on territorial politics of the UK, and has had major impact on the Irish state, a state and political economy that had no voice and had no say in how Brexit would pan out. Secondly, and equally important, is the nature of Brexit itself. In other words, once the United Kingdom opted to leave the single market and customs union and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, that meant that the rupture between, potentially between North and South, but also between the two islands, and also between the United Kingdom and the EU, was much deeper and much more salient than other forms of Brexit. So in my view, yes, relationships matter, they're crucial, but we also have to begin, in my view, from the structural features that flow directly from the nature of the Brexit that the United Kingdom has pursued. And if one looks at that Brexit, what was the fundamental driver of those who sat on the UK side of the table negotiating the TCA? The fundamental driver was a sovereignty first Brexit. But of course, a sovereignty first Brexit had implications for the border on the island of Ireland, because if it were to be applied to Northern Ireland, a sovereignty first Brexit inevitably and inexorably would have led to a visible border and harder border on the island of Ireland. So I think we need to begin with those structural features. Now, where are we in these relationships? I would say we are at a very testing and delicate time. We have, and if you want to map the dimensions of that, then just look at three speeches. Jeffrey Donaldson, David Frost at the British Irish Association, and Maroš Šefčovič at Queen's. And that lays out in rather stark terms where we're at, and the differences in the perspectives and in the framing, in the objectives and the intent are pretty clear to see. So let's begin with David Frost. David Frost was speaking to the UK command paper issued in July on the Northern Ireland Protocol. That command paper and David Frost's speech was essentially the objective of the London government is to hollow out the agreement that that government and Parliament signed with the EU and ratified a very short time ago. In other words, they want to hollow out the existing protocol and alter it, and in essence, they're looking for a renegotiation. They may not call it renegotiation, but that's effectively what they're looking for. Now, I also thought it was interesting, and this goes back again to what Madeleine said about truth and candor, when he said the truth is the protocol is the problem. Now, fast forward to Maroš Šefčovič, and he speaking on behalf of the EU. That is not the truth. That is the truth for Brussels, the EU, or the Dublin government. They do not see the protocol as the problem. They see the structural features of Brexit as the problem, and the Northern Ireland Protocol as an attempt to deal with that, and an agreed attempt that was signed and ratified by the House of Commons. So where does the EU come from just now? It wants to reduce the megaphone diplomacy, the politicization of the protocol. It wants to dial down the rhetoric that we hear, and there's no evidence in my view that the rhetoric is being dialed down. Now, I think the Commission has learned, it knows it needs to listen to people on the ground in Northern Ireland. It knows it needs to come up with solutions to the problems that inevitably flow from what is a complex suboptimal solution. So I think what the EU will attempt to do over the next month is it will publish its papers on specific areas, but also on the role that the Northern Ireland institutions and civil society might play in informing how the protocol is implemented from an EU perspective. But the truth for the EU is very different to the truth or framing from London. And the gap, in my view, is extraordinarily wide. And then, of course, that takes place against the backdrop of the Jeffrey Donaldson approach, where he simply wants to void the protocol altogether. That's where the DUP are, withdrawing from the North-South institutions. So the parties, as we face into the winter, are very far apart. The EU will attempt to be sectoral, technocratic, will attempt to solve real problems as they see it. Whereas I think the approach from London is a sovereignty first approach, where they want to get rid of from the protocol, for example, the role of the European Court of Justice. And that for the EU is a red line. There is only one legal institution in the world that can adjudicate on European law, and that is the European Court of Justice. So I find it very difficult as we approach the end of September to see how there will be a negotiation, there will be commission papers by about mid-October, 4 of them. I find it very difficult to see how this does not become a forever war in terms of a war of words, a war of deeds, a war that, in other words, a lack of trust between the two sides, i.e. the EU and the UK. So it could be very interesting to see, given the UK command paper and what the EU will publish in October, is there a room and a space for a negotiation that leads to an outcome that provides more stability and a safer equilibrium for a post-Brexit relationships between the two islands. And of course, it's also, let me finish by saying that the EU regards Brexit as done. It sees Brexit as something that is now a matter of the implementation of accords that had been agreed. It was not accidental that the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, did not mention Brexit once in her State of the Union speech. I think that this takes place against the backdrop of the German elections next week, leading into French elections next year, but also the complexities now of the transatlantic relationship and the Australian-French debacle. So I think there are layers and levels of complexity, and there are solutions to be found. Of that, I have no doubt, and I think solutions that everyone could live with. But if those solutions may not see the light of day, if, in my view, the United Kingdom, the ask is more than the EU can ever and will ever offer. And also remember that the EU holds the legal cards because the UK did ratify and did agree these agreements. So for the EU, it's working within the protocol. For the UK, it's the hollowing out of the protocol. And for the DUP, it's no protocol at all. These are very different worlds of truth and candor and empathy. Thank you.
For that insight into the nature of the dispute that we have at the minute, as you describe it, a clear rupture and with no obvious sign of how it's going to be resolved. Maris Sefcovic, I think, very recently said that the protocol must not become, the debate over the protocol must not become eternal. You talked about the importance of structures as alongside relationships. Is there anything you think that can be done structurally that maybe might help to break the impasse? Or are we simply going to have to wait for one or other side to blink?
So I think if one were to read the future simply from what people have stated publicly, then one has to be very pessimistic. But one has to ask, is it in the interests of the EU or London that there is a serious breach and rupture on the protocol? In other words, could we envisage the London government triggering Article 16? And in my view, that then spreads into the TCA and into the broader relationship. Also, Europe has a lot of big ticket items at the moment, post-COVID recovery, the climate deal, digital. It really wants to get this to a stable place. So I think the EU will work very hard on what I would call the practical sectoral responses. But what it won't do is concede to London on major EU red lines, such as the jurisdiction of the court. It's not going to be lectured by David Frost on sovereign equality, etc., etc.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. I think we'll move on now to Nicola Mallon. There are some of those points which Bridget has made, which I'm sure will come up again as the conversation develops. But Nicola, over to you.
Well, thank you, David, and for the opportunity to be here today. I think maybe I'll just start by saying, that I'm the Deputy Leader of the SDLP as well as Minister for Infrastructure, and obviously the SDLP didn't want Brexit, and we campaigned against it because we recognised the damage that it would cause economically to political relationships as well, and also the psychological impact of having a border anywhere here. So you can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm not going to go into who owns Brexit and who's rewriting history, but what I would say is that the manner in which the UK has left the European Union has fundamentally altered political relationships that are hugely impactful here. And that is not a Remainer or a Leaver analysis. That's an evidential and observable fact. If we look at political unionism, for example, it's in turmoil, and we're seeing that play out. So it's had a huge impact within political unionism. It has accelerated the conversation around the constitution here, about building a new agreed Ireland, and there's more people coming to that conversation than would have been the case before. And it's putting strains on an already fraught executive. It has also had a huge impact on Anglo-Irish relations. I think it's no secret to say that they are at an all-time low. And stating the obvious, there are very clear tensions between the British government and the European Union. It has also heightened the tensions between the Scottish government and the British government. And you can see that Brexit is playing very much into the debate there and the move around constitutional independence. And what we have seen from this British government is a continual overreach into the devolved sphere. And Wales is kicking back on that as well. So there are tensions right across these islands. And of course, Anglo-American relationships have been impacted. And we saw the very clear warning from President Biden this week. And obviously, it's impacting on Irish-American relationships as well. So all of this has political consequences and it has economic consequences. And I suppose from a Northern Ireland executive point of view, these tensions couldn't come, at a worse time. We are dealing with a pandemic that we're still very much in the grips of. We have a crisis in our health service, a crisis in our public services, and also we have the global challenge facing us all of the climate emergency. So these strains that are coming, the impact that this is having on our relationships, actually is coming at a time when our shared challenges, the level of our shared challenges has never been greater. If you look at the climate emergency, for example. And I noted Bridget's point around this analysis that the protocol is the problem. And I agree that the protocol is a symptom of Brexit, and there are absolutely difficulties with it. And we need to all be working together to find the pragmatic solutions to those difficulties. There are also many economic advantages to be had from our unique access to both the European Union and the GB market, and we should be working to maximise that as well. And there are solutions that are being proposed around veterinary agreement for SBS checks, which would remove up to 80% of our checks on plants and animals. So we should be very much focused on trying to work through the difficulties, but also maximising the opportunities that are there to be had. And we need to look at the structural tools that we have to try to deal with these difficulties. And I know you asked Bridget about the structural issues. So we have the Good Friday Agreement. Within the Good Friday Agreement, we have Strand 3, which is the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference. I think that has a really important place to play in this. And also we have Strand 2 around North-South. And there's obviously Article 14 within the protocol, which enables the North-South Ministerial Council to be representations to the Joint Committee. But all of this will only work if there is that willingness to work and to work through these difficulties together. And I'm struck by the words of John Hume, who said, that when people are divided, the only solution is agreement. And that's really what we need to be very much focused on. So I think for me, it's about all of us stepping back from the microphones. It's about rolling up our sleeves and getting stuck in. And it's not helpful for the DUP to be threatening to collapse the institutions. It's not helpful for the British government to be threatening to trigger Article 16. I think what we really need to see people doing here right across the board is stepping up and not walking away.
Okay, there's no doubt that combination of Brexit, the pandemic, climate change, on top of the ongoing problems we've had in this society for many, many years, economic and social. You know, any one of those would be a major challenge for an executive at any time, but to have three come along more or less at the same time is quite extraordinary. You know, and obviously I'm aware that, you know, it is much more difficult to deal with these things if ministers aren't in place. And I'm just wondering if you're concerned about the impact that the possible collapse of the institutions might have on our ability just to deal with these things.
I'm hugely concerned by it. You know, the executive came around the table after 3 years of no government, so ministers had huge in-trays. We had a lot of issues that hadn't been dealt with in the absence of ministers, and then we were hit with a pandemic. We also have huge strains right across our health service and in our public services, so there's a real need for urgent reform. And it is a difficult task. You have 5 parties, 5 different perspectives politically, ideologically, and we've tried to work through the pandemic. I think that what we really need to do is to be stepping up, introducing the reforms that are required, and of course, I said, in my address around the climate emergency as well. So none of that is solved by people walking away. We've seen last time round when we didn't have the executive for 3 years, that waiting lists grew, we fell back further. So, you know, with all of the challenges that are facing our citizens and businesses, there's an onus and a responsibility on all of us to be stepping up and to be showing leadership.
Is there a risk in a 5-party coalition that when you have a difficult issue, you end up with a sort of lowest common denominator solution, you know, or is there maybe a better way of dealing with some of these issues?
Yeah, I think that when you have a 5-party executive, there's always a danger that it becomes a bartering process, predominantly between the DUP and Sinn Féin as the 2 largest parties. And a bartering process doesn't lead to the best outcomes for people, but there's a reality of the political environment. But what we need to be doing is, as I said, there are tools there. You know, we have different views about Brexit around the executive table, but there's agreement that there are challenges with the protocol. We should be working to find pragmatic solutions. We should realise that there are economic advantages to be had, and we should be maximising those opportunities for our businesses. And then, of course, through the Good Friday Agreement, whether it's the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference or whether it's North-South structures, you know, there are opportunities there for us to be working together, and that's where the answer lies.
Yeah, do you want to, we sometimes tend to get preoccupied with the difficulties, but do you maybe want to say a bit more just about what the opportunities are, and, you know, maybe outline some of the things that we should be focusing on rather than just always being preoccupied with the difficulties? Yeah,
I think that's one of the frustrations that I'm having with the issue around Brexit. There is a political agenda to try to close down any discussion around the economic opportunities that are to be had. So if you look at North-South trade figures, for example, dramatic improvements there. And we are uniquely placed in Northern Ireland in terms of having access to both markets. That's a unique position that we should be working to maximise. So there are economic advantages to be had. As I said, there's relationships that we should be working on. But for me, the real challenge here is politics, as we know in this place of ours, only works if you build the relationships, if you continue to work at them, differences and all. So for me, the big focus has to be on trying to rebuild the relationships that are being so badly damaged. Okay,
and just one last question. The concerns that unionists have about some of the negative impacts of the protocol, how do you see those being addressed?
I'm very keen to try to work with anyone in politics, and I don't think they're just solely unionist concerns. I mean, the SDLP has been straight up, and I as Minister recognise that there are challenges with the protocol, and we should be finding pragmatic solutions. But I think what we need to understand is what are the economic barriers and difficulties, and then what is the concerns around identity. And for me, I feel that largely for political unionism, the concerns are in the space of their identity, their sense of who they are, their sense of connection to the UK. And that's what, if that is what it is, then we need to have the honest conversation around that. That's why we warned, because we could see wherever the border was to come, it was going to cause huge psychological damage. And that's why we campaigned against it. I don't want to dismiss those concerns in any way, but we need to be honest and talk about what the real issues are.
Okay, thank you. Pete, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to the Centre for Cross-Border Studies. I want to take a slightly maybe a broader approach to this, and I think a lot of what has evolved in terms of Brexit and the protocol is actually missing out on maybe other debates and conversations we should be having about where the global economy is going and what that might mean actually in the future for all of us. And of course, trying to think about evolving social and economic contexts is like asking a fish to ride a bicycle. Now, I know in the age of social media, somebody will produce a photograph later on of a fish riding a bicycle.
Somebody's working on it as we speak.
Somebody's working on it as we speak. So I think what's important is to understand that change happens. And it can be positive and it can also be very negative. But I think most of all, things like Brexit and the protocol, it's like the river that goes underground. You know, it'll emerge at some point when the conditions permit. You know, we've already seen this throughout the last century. You know, borders have become less arbitrary. Some borders have become even more porous to the extent that they're nearly invisible. And now what we're seeing is borders being put back in place or borders that are becoming slightly more permeable. I think as society and as people, of course, we should always think of Robert Frost's poem about mending walls. Before I built a wall, I asked to know what I was walling in or walling out. And very much part of his poem ends with that famous line about something there is that doesn't love a wall. And I think it's important to understand that, you know, the whole process of globalisation has been about creating these flat surfaces. And what we're actually in at the minute is a reaction against that. And that's not just here in little old home, but that's something which is right across the world. Brexit and the Good Friday Agreement are both events. You know, they're things they are like the underground river. We don't know where they'll end up because we don't know what the conclusion is because we haven't got there. But if you look at something like a Good Friday Agreement, you see that sense in the last census, you know, 40% British, 25 or 28% Irish, and then there's 29% Northern Irish, or a combination of that. So you can see how things like the Good Friday Agreement changed identity to a certain extent, because what you had was a process of a younger generation not living in violence and going, you know, something, I'm a Northerner, but I'm also Irish, or, you know, some sort of complexity that was creeping in this society. So you sort of see that as plain sailing. This society's changing. Young people are being less sort of binary in their choices, etc. And then, of course, we get Brexit, and then we get something that forces all of that positive change and difference back upon us. The other thing is, of course, as human beings, we are essentially parochial. When you send a text, you're more likely to send it to the district council area in which you live. We're not as global and connected in many ways. So all of the things that affect us in life and society are both global and local. And I think these things are important. And of course, 100 years ago, when a border was created on this island, and in many ways that border was ossified, and was ossified by the behaviour of two states. They both controlled dissent, both controlled women, both favoured majorities, both defined identity in a very particular way, and both used violence, both physical and symbolic. And I think what's interesting when we come to this question of borders, you saw in Lamass and O'Neill in the 60s. Of course, everybody here is too young enough to remember this.
I remember it well.
But when Lamass and O'Neill tried to affect cooperation, they were confronted by outrage. So at one point, they were confronted by the bourgeoisie of the south of Ireland, who were, you're going to bring in globalisation and undermine our markets, etc. And of course, you had Paisley throwing snowballs and no surrender and Rome rule and all of that as well. But one of the things, going back to this analogy of the river, a file note at that time said, no final conclusion was, of course, reached on any of these matters. The discussion was purely in the nature of a preliminary tour de horizon. It was agreed that the two sides would exchange papers outlining matters in which they would welcome consultation and or cooperation. So a river of sorts then was forced underground by violence. And again, where it re-emerges is in the European project, and where it comes out again is obviously in the whole rise of global economies. And of course, we ended up in this world in which, you know, borders were, to all intent and purposes, sort of disappearing in many ways. We had this accelerated trade movement. We had identities, you know, we had this European feel, we had this era of mass consumption and standardisation. Wearing the same clothes, shopping, you know, go to High Street now anywhere in Europe, it's basically the same. And of course, this whole border reimagination, this whole way in which, you know, cool Europe and transformed Europe and the Europe of the young, of course, was also at the same time being paralysed by insidious racism. It was being paralysed by the rejection of the movement of labour. It was being paralleled by the rise of the right. And of course, just as we got rid of the Cold War, it came back again. So this is what I mean. We always need to be very careful, because things can be happening which are actually paralleling each other, some of which are good and some of which are very undermining. And that whole economic model that we created, during the European Union, etc., it also undermined workers' rights. We ended up with a Europe in which one section of society was having its skills upgraded, as another section of society was having its skills downplayed, and communities that went through massive deindustrialization. One of the other things that happened, which creates this change in the dynamic of societies, was the re-emergence of the cities. If you actually look at Europe today, it's not a question of nation states, it's cities, it's medieval. We're going back to the medieval time. Paris, London, Rome, Barcelona, Madrid, these are the big vacuums that suck in power, even here in our small scale version, Belfast. And of course, what we also had on this island was this big desire to drive things north-south. And I think that's really interesting, because what's actually happened on this island has to be abandonment of the rural west. Go west. It's not go west, young person. It's go east. Go to Dublin, go to Belfast, go to London. So in many ways, we also have to remember, we had this big growth in our economy. Many people benefited from that, new economies, all of that. There were a lot of people left behind. And I think these are always things that should be at the back of our mind. So the Celtic Tiger, the new Northern Ireland, for many people, many of us, it was the social mobility. It was the next step up the ladder of well-being. But also for many people was pervasive disparity. And economics is always about labour and capital and how they are restructured and put in place, and infrastructure, of course. Very important to mention infrastructure. So, and of course, the thing we always have to remember, a place may appear prosperous one day and then can be completely flat on its feet the next. And you can build politics around prosperity, but prosperity is not something that's fixed or rooted. Prosperity is something that can go away very quickly. And if you ever get an opportunity to look at Harman's book, Zombie Capitalism, by 2007, international trade flows were 30 times greater than they were 50 years ago. The whole movement of finance across national borders, the whole way in which that grew, especially since the 1930s. The typical firm in the 40s, 50s, or 60s was maybe a big player in its nation. It's now, if it's a big player, is it probably at least operating in at least 20 other countries. So, and we go back to Lamassoure and O'Neill. This is what they saw. They saw the world economy was changing. They saw that internationalisation was coming, and of course, society wasn't prepared for that. I think it's also important to understand we don't live in an economies of free markets. We actually live in an economy of monopolies and oligopolies. And of course, what we have had is as those have risen, the power of the state has declined. And I think one of the things we're actually living in now is the re-emergence of the state, and the desire of the state to attract and retain capital is critically important for the reproduction of the state. Brexit clearly was an attempt to create this flat surface, movement of goods, movement of people, etc. And of course, within British society, created certain tensions. Europe seen as a monolith, people wanted to control the internal market, and the rise of what I've said before, this thing called order liberalism, which is the state trying to find ways to control dissent and all of that within a society. So, as much as globalisation tries to create flat surfaces, it also builds the opposite, nationalism. It also brings back nationalism. And of course, this brings us to the question of where are we going. So, we don't know where we're going, but let's guess a little bit about what's happening in our economy. The first thing is obviously changing and will continue to change is the position of women in Western societies. And of course, that will have more women will become more prominent within our economy, rightly so. And of course, that will change fertility, and that will change the nature at which people start families, etc. Because careers will shift the way in which we live. The thing we're in at the minute is the economy we're in at the minute is big data and analytics. This is what's changing the world. It will drive consumption. It will change consumption. It will drive waves of e-commerce, helped by COVID. Where I live in Liverpool, I think Amazon and DHL are at the door. I think it should put a tent outside or put the warehouse outside because they're here so often. Retail's going to disappear on our main streets. We are going to break those social bonds in our societies. You could end up, with the marginalised and the aged who rely upon the local shop, who maybe don't have a credit card to buy goods, etc. You actually see that, many cities across Europe now, you go down to charity shop, charity shop, charity shop, charity shop. Local shops, domestic businesses gone. Technological advancement will, of course, drive lives longer. Lower birth rates, as I've said, will mean that big technology will be even more critical. We're going to end up in an economy about pension systems, consumer behaviour and healthcare. The other one that's coming down, I've no good news. the other one that's coming down the line is artificial intelligence. It's going to change the world. We at present are in the fourth industrial revolution. That's what we're in at present. And that's going to be driven by artificial intelligence. Multi-wave evolutionary period, this is what we're in now, come out of knowledge engineering, progress to model and algorithm-based machine learning, and is increasingly focused on perception, reasoning, and generalization. The global workforce is going to go through a massive transition. The World Economic Forum 2 years ago said nearly a third of the most important skill sets in 2025 will be comprised in skills and technology, yet considered to be imperative to the job market. This is rapid shifts within our society. Artificial intelligence, if this is the wave and where the economies are going, the top countries are China, the United States, United Kingdom, some of the Scandinavian countries. They're already way ahead. Britain, the United States has invested 10 billion in artificial intelligence. The United Kingdom has invested 8 billion. It's actually out of step with the rest of Europe. It is the European leader in artificial intelligence. So this throws up all sorts of questions about where society is going and what that will do. You could end up, there is no work. The machine does everything. So I think it's important that we understand that. The other big shift in our society, which we have to understand, is that access to the labour market and access to premium quality work in the labour market is now based upon a university degree. Where a university degree used to be about education, university degree now is an asset. The university degree is now a way you buy yourself. You literally pay for yourself to get this ticket that gets you into the knowledge economy. And what's also happened is not only has that happened, but as we suck more people into the cities, they become impossible to buy a home in. So yes, you look at Dublin, is it something in Ireland like 13 or 14, only 13 or 14% of people under the age of 40 own their own home. So when you talk about economics and where we're going and how we evolve, these are big social questions, which is, the rise of Sinn Féin in the South East, which links in. It's not the rise of Sinn Féin because of the national question. It's the rise of Sinn Féin because of the housing market. It's because people can't access their first home. And these are the sorts of things that I don't think we actually talk about. And I think that there are ways in which these are the things that we should be talking about and things that we should be engaged with. So, what we have here then, if we get back to Brexit and the protocol, and of course you're right, Brexit's the problem, protocol's the symptom. It's a bad symptom. That nasty cold was around the last few weeks. It's not great. And I agree with Bridget. It's about the way in which we get the best out of this, and there's certain things can be changed and mitigated. But what we ended up with Brexit was the threat of violence. What we ended up with in the protocol was violence. We saw the emergence again of constitutional politics. We saw the emergence of identity. We saw the emergence of myth and hyperbole. So when I started off talking about the census is showing us this new agreed younger generation who are, I'm a bit Nordy, but I'm also a bit Irish or whatever else, or they're able to see a complexity in their identity. Brexit and all of this brought us right back to the opening tract. It brought us back to the first page. So the constitutional question, perfidious Albion, perfidious Ireland, threats of violence, street protests, data fog, and virtually no one thinking about the challenges I've just talked about. Yet again, distraction of identity politics, carrying us into something where we should be having the conversations they're having in Cambridge, where we should be having the conversations they're having in London and in Beijing and in Frankfurt and in New York and in LA. We're not beyond doing that. If this is where the world economy is probably going, and we're talking about how many people were out in the street last week protesting against the protocol. So there's something we haven't got a political maturity. We're back with Lomas and O'Neill. We're back in the world of reaction and all of that. What does it mean if Ireland's not at the AI table, artificial intelligence table? What does it mean if Northern Ireland as part of the UK is? What does it mean if global tax rates go up to 15%? What does it mean that we've virtually abandoned rural Ireland? When I hear people talking about this, you go down the west coast of Ireland, you see all these towns and villages are abandoned. Petrol station automated, pubs boarded up, the whole social and coherent life, a nation, whatever, this economic model we have has abandoned people. We're not talking about that. We're talking about identity and constitutional politics. We aren't talking about what it means that people can't afford to buy their own home. You see with young people now, my daughter included, they buy a dog because they want love in their lives, but they can't afford to have a kid, can't afford to buy a house. So we have this socially mobile graduate labour market, which doesn't have the benefits that people of our generation did. So these are the things we should be talking about. What about the service economy? What about the fact that, you know, service workers are living 5 to a room? What about the people who don't have the skill sets to join the economy, the new evolving economy that we have? And of course, what about those who've been abandoned? So the conversation we have end up in is it's the fault of the immigrants or it's the fault of the Emmons? Well, there's bigger and more important questions to be answered. There's other ways to create wealth in society, wealth builders, social economy, green economics, that can be used to build society. So I think it's all about, just to finish off on a few points, I think it's critically important we start to have conversations that visualise blended economies, that challenge this drift in our societies. You know, we're not going to build social prosperity and shared prosperity if we have the Orwellian cry of North's better than South and South's better than North. And of course, we're not going to if we have these constitutional eye-poking politics, when we're certainly not going to have proper social and economic evolution. And as we turn to the script, so one of the things I just want to finish on is there's a letter we did a few weeks ago, a civic society letter, and what we were trying to do in that was to challenge this incapacity to get beyond identities and binaries and perfidious Albion, perfidious Ireland, etc. And we actually achieved that, you know, not that I like using these terms, but orange and green, and Catholic and Protestant, and North and South, trade union, business leaders, and community leaders, of course, the much less important academics took part as well. So what we called for was the whole process about, you know, the question about finger-pointing Brexit protocol. We're in a discussion negotiation period. In a discussion negotiation period, civic society should be aiding the discussion negotiation process. That's what's important, okay? There's no point me saying I didn't vote Brexit and I'm a Remainer. That horse is gone, it's bolted. So what's important here is what we call for mutually agreed solutions that resolve economic, political and societal tensions caused by Brexit and the Ireland-Northern Ireland Protocol. And let's think about this. You mentioned John Hume. Like, we've solved bigger crises than this. We stopped the 30-year conflict. Okay. We were motivated by the whole question of parity, esteem and mutual respect. You know, that bit in the Good Friday Agreement was one of the reasons why I voted for it. Parity, esteem and mutual respect. It'd be good to do that. It'd be good to achieve that in a fashion that resolved the totality of the relations embedded north, south, east, west. You asked Nicola about, you know, concerns of unionists. You know, whether those concerns are vocalised in the right way, but it does seem peculiar if we created this Good Friday Agreement and it was about the totality of relationships, we ended up with those relationships being undermined to some extent. So very much what we were trying to do was to build that whole question of how do we achieve proportionality. But you asked Nicola, the opportunities. I speak to people who are investors, they want to come here. This is a big opportunity. Would it be good to have a conversation about that and say, maybe, how are we going to get the workers? How are we going to facilitate this investment into Northern Ireland? Will we have the right skill sets? It's a bit hard to do that when you can't bring in immigrants. So the whole point of that civic society initiative was to get back to problems can be solved, solutions can be achieved. And the one thing that's critically important in this society is, what was the peace process for if civic society is not able to enter into this crisis and tension and offer solutions and offer leadership to this society? And I think this is not just the crisis that we're in, but this is the point that civic society needs to understand, that and it has been doing this quietly, but it also needs to do it much more firmly. It needs to enter the public square, assist people like Nicola, etc. You'll have experienced during the COVID how important civic society was. Okay, so this is what we're in now, because if we want to have those conversations about AI, if we want to have these conversations about an ageing society, if we want to have these conversations about skills and driving fair and equal prosperity, then civic society has to be a major part of that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pete. A tour de force in terms of reminding us of some of the big issues that are coming down the track, some of the things that perhaps we don't devote enough time to think about. And indeed, I was reminded very recently that in 2043 in Northern Ireland, 45% of the population will be over 65. And the impact that's going to have on public services is going to be enormous. And we probably are not thinking enough about that at the moment. I've been fascinated myself by this challenge in terms of how can we involve civic society more. And, you know, I think there is certainly, you know, I'll maybe turn to you, Nicola, there's no doubt when I'm out and about speaking to people in the third sector, the business sector, there is a sort of frustration at times that it's harder to get things done. You know, any thoughts from your perspective as to just how we might involve civic society more in some of these big issues, and indeed ways in which civic society can actually help ministers and the executive to deal with some of the big issues?
Yeah, I mean, I agree absolutely with what Pete said on that. It's absolutely right that you should be involved in civic society and citizens. And, you know, we have signed up to citizens' assemblies here in Northern Ireland. We're not able to make progress in that. I think it's really important, and Pete's done a lot of work on that. I think we need to get on with that. I think that our citizens are ahead of politicians, and it's the politics that paralyses this place, not our people. And from the infrastructure position, I've been liaising with ministerial colleagues and secured agreement that we would establish an infrastructure commission as part of our strategy in recovering from COVID. But a key part of an infrastructure commission is about going out and engaging with the public, having a conversation about infrastructure, having a conversation about government spend and investment. Because, for example, as a Minister for Infrastructure, I'll take decisions involving huge sums of public money, which will shape our infrastructure and define people's opportunities for decades to come. So it's absolutely right that I should be involved in citizens in that. I'm also keen to move ahead with a youth assembly on infrastructure as well, because we need to be engaging our young people in those kind of public discussions and involving them in decision making, not just having them there as a token gesture, you know, like I've consulted with Box Text, but actually involve our citizens in our decisions. And I also believe involving them in taking budgetary decisions as well. So we are far behind in terms of, as an executive, of embracing this. I think there's a fear among some quarters that you're going to lose control. But actually, it's empowering to engage with citizens. Everybody is much more informed, and that's the best way of getting to the best outcomes. Okay.
Pete, I'd like to come back to the issue about how we might shift away from identity politics. I'm conscious of time, and I'm conscious that Jess has been waiting there for a while. So, Jess, you may be last, but you're very much not least. So, I'd be interested just in your perspective from a London viewpoint, if you like. So over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here, and thank you to my fellow panellists for some really fascinating contributions. I want to bring it back to the protocol. I hope I won't bore you all, but what I'm hoping to do is set out some things that I think could help us reach these mutually agreed solutions that Peter was talking about there. I think first we can start with where we are at the moment. And I think the UK's government's announcements that it will extend the grace periods indefinitely, and perhaps more importantly, the EU's muted response to that, means that the situation at the moment is relatively stable. I think we've avoided an escalation in UK and EU tensions and potential for serious trade disruption that could have occurred at the end of this month if action wasn't taken. But I also think the situation is increasingly uncertain. And I think now more than ever, there are real questions about what happens now, what happens to the protocol. I think there's a risk that unless the UK and the EU can reach agreement in the near future, that we might stay in this limbo where the protocol is a legal reality, but it's not fully implemented and remains very highly contested. And I think this would be a very suboptimal scenario. And I think there are major problems with this. And for two reasons. The first is that while the protocol remains under question, I think it will continue to be a source of political instability. And I think it will make it very difficult for the executive to function effectively, if at all. And I think, as we've already seen, the political fallout has also created challenges for north-south working and also east-west working. So it's very important that we're able to kind of move past that. But I also think that while we continue in this state of uncertainty, that will impede Northern Ireland's ability to take advantage of those kind of benefits and opportunities of the protocol that Nicola identified earlier. I think Northern Ireland is in a very unique position in being able to access both the EU single market and the UK internal market. But while there are still questions about what is happening, I think that there's a risk that that could put off investors. So I think now the focus, now we have this extra time, really does need to be on kind of finding agreement. And I think the UK and the EU need to use this extra time to intensify discussions. Perhaps naively, I think with political will, we can make progress. And I think there are a few things that could be done to help that. I think first of all, there's the need to build an evidence base. I think to find solutions to the challenges created by the protocol, we need to better understand the problems. Bridget talked earlier about the fact that the truth for the EU is very different from the truth to the UK in terms of how the protocol is operating. There's a real disagreement on both the nature and perhaps more importantly, the scale of some of these problems. And part of that is because we have very little data on GBNI trade flows. We had very little data before the protocol was introduced. We still don't have much data on kind of how things are working or how it's changed, and little analysis about the actual or potential effects of the protocol. Most of all, we're kind of working off kind of this anecdotal evidence. And I think that has been a key barrier to making progress, because both sides are able to find examples that would suit kind of the particular argument they want to make. I think one thing that could be done to help remedy this problem is the UK and the EU could commission independent research into the functioning of the protocol. I mean, ideally that would help inform discussions that are currently going on. But I think more importantly, if we set it up now, it can help inform discussions that might happen in the future. I think the protocol is going to be a living thing. It's going to change and evolve over time. And I think the more we can build a shared evidence base and avoid this kind of competing claims about what's happening, the more we can focus on how to actually find solutions that address the problems that evidence has identified. I think it's also very much in the UK's interest to get a better idea about what goods are entering Northern Ireland, what happens to them in the supply chain and where they end up. Ultimately, if they want to make the argument that the protocol isn't a threat to the Northern Ireland, to the EU single market, and therefore there should be greater flexibility, it's going to need evidence to back that up. So I think it's in both sides' interest to focus on the evidence here. I think the second thing that needs to be done very urgently is to agree what options are actually on the table. I think we're not going to get anywhere if one side comes to the negotiating table wanting to talk about technical fixes and the other side wants to talk about these major fundamental changes. I think there's a real need to establish common ground. I think the UK government needs to recognise that it was this UK government that signed the withdrawal agreement and this UK Parliament that approved it, and take some responsibility for that. I think it needs to acknowledge that completely reopening the arrangements is not a possibility either politically or practically. But I think equally the EU also needs to acknowledge that we are where we are politically, and there are problems that won't be addressed by kind of minor tweaks. If the protocol is going to be able to survive, it needs to be acceptable to all the people of Northern Ireland. And so I think they will need to go further in finding flexibilities and solutions than perhaps they have been willing to before. And I also think we need to focus attention on the most positive and promising opportunities on the protocol. And I think a lot of that can involve building on the protocol rather than changing the underlying terms, and indeed building on the trade and cooperation agreement, because actually there are ambitions set out in both sides' mandate about finding some kind of agreement on SPS and on medicines as well that weren't actually achieved. So I think there is an opportunity here to build on the protocol, and as far as possible, I think focus should be on those opportunities. I think another thing that needs to be done is to put Northern Ireland views at the very heart of the discussion. Ultimately, the purpose of the protocol is to protect the peace and prosperity of Northern Ireland. But I think this kind of rolling set of high-profile EU-UK disputes have really kind of made it at the forefront of the UK-EU relationship, not really about the kind of interests of the region anymore. I think both the UK and the EU need to find ways to ensure that Northern Ireland voices, and we talked a bit just now about kind of civic voices, so it's not just the politicians. They need to find a way to make sure that they are very central to the discussion. And I think David Finnemore and Katie Hayward have set out some ways that the UK and the EU could improve engagement with the protocol through more transparency, through formalising consultation processes and making sure that Northern Ireland officials are included at in those key meetings. I think Another thing that can be done, and perhaps the most important thing, is that both sides need to be willing to compromise. It's not that solutions don't exist, it's that the politics is the main barrier. Fundamentally, neither the UK or the EU at the moment are willing to shift from their entrenched positions. But there is an incompatibility between the EU's kind of zero risk approach to the single market and the UK's desire for complete regulatory autonomy. I think we can only really make progress here if both sides are willing to compromise at a political level. And I think fundamentally they need to, because there is no alternative to the protocol and there is no way forward that doesn't involve some kind of mutually agreed solutions. Although the EU has mechanisms through the European Court of Justice to try and force the UK government to comply with EU law, this UK government, to be completely frank, does not seem to be particularly bothered by that and almost seems to welcome at a political level some of those legal challenges. But the UK too can't easily dispose of its international obligations. I think Article 16 is not this kind of universal get out clause that the UK government sometimes presents it as. And even if the Northern Ireland Assembly withhold consent for the protocol when it's given the opportunity to do so, which is perhaps an unlikely scenario, but even in the instance that it does, that will trigger further discussions in the Joint Committee. The challenges that the protocol is designed to prevent won't just go away. So I think it's really important that the UK and the EU do use this time wisely and try and find solutions and use this time to get their heads down and try and find a way through the impasse.
Okay, thank you for that, Jess. Obviously, and you've highlighted this, you know, obviously the UK government now has sovereignty. It now has freedom to set its own regulatory path, if you like. But Northern Ireland obviously is going to have to remain in sort of dynamic regulatory alignment with the EU, which will be an ongoing source of tension. Have you any thoughts on just how the UK, the EU, the Irish government, the executive here can actually address this? Because I do foresee this being a real difficulty going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually one of the consequences of the kind of short-term focus on the implementation of the protocol and all of the kind of arguments about that has meant that there has been very little consideration or discussion of how the protocol will function in the long term, and what are, you know, to some extent now hypothetical challenges will become real when, you know, something that can be sold in GB can't be sold in Northern Ireland. And I think there needs to be much more thought on all sides about how we manage this. I think fundamentally there are kind of several different dimensions to kind of managing regulatory divergence in this space. I think officially you have the bodies under the withdrawal agreements that are going to be responsible for exchanging information and having some of these discussions. So it's the Joint Consultative Working Group that will be the official mechanism for exchanging information about regulations that might be relevant between the UK and the EU. But it's quite likely that that information exchange will come kind of when the policy's already been set and there's not a huge amount of opportunity to be able to kind of respond or make changes based on evidence or points raised in about the Northern Ireland specific context. So I think there's a need to make sure there are these upstream discussions in all policymaking processes about the implications of the protocol. So I think at an EU level, there's a need to find ways to make sure that Northern Ireland feeds into the EU policy process. And I'd be very interested in kind of Bridget's views as to whether or how this could be done. I think it's also very important to make use of the Good Friday Agreement institutions, the North-South Ministerial Council. It's regrettable that the DUP is not currently engaging in that, but the Republic of Ireland remains a member of the EU, and where Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, where their interests are aligned, there is the opportunity for Northern Ireland perspectives to feed into the EU policymaking process through that. I think the East-West institutions will also be very useful in this sense. The British Irish Council in particular, because in some of these areas, particularly around agriculture, regulatory responsibility is devolved. So it's not just the UK government that needs to think about the implications of any regulatory choices on Northern Ireland and the operation of the protocol, but it's the Scottish and the Welsh government. So there's a kind of another angle there. And I think on the UK side as well, there is a need to make sure that consideration of Northern Ireland and the obligations under the protocol are fully embedded into all of the UK government's policy process. And I think what we've seen over Brexit is that sometimes Northern Ireland is an afterthought, despite kind of Madeleine and the NIO's best efforts. It's not necessarily ingrained in the kind of psyche of the rest of Whitehall, and that some departments just don't think about Northern Ireland or the consequences. And I think the more that we have this kind of risk of regulatory divergence, the more of a problem that's going to become. One of the things the IFG's recommended in a report we put out last May was that, you know, you could have something like a Northern Ireland Protocol impact statement. So think through the consequences of a change in regulation in GB or for England, and what the implications of that would be for trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, those sorts of things. But I think it's a question that we haven't really thought enough about yet. And I think something going forward, hopefully if we can find agreement on the solutions of how the protocol will operate in the long term, that will free up a lot of space to have these discussions about how the protocol is going to work in the long term to make sure that it is sustainable.
Okay, thanks, Jess. Bridget, do you want to just comment on any of Jess's remarks there?
Well, I think that the Commission intends bringing forward a paper on the role of Northern Ireland institutions, politicians, and also civil society in the implementation of the protocol. And I think that's a very, very good thing. I think there are levels and layers. One could imagine that civil servants from Northern Ireland would have access to some of the expert committees in the Commission. Now, there's always a tension here, because what the Commission would not want is London-based civil servants hopping across to Brussels, sitting on crucial committees, wanting to use this access, not just in relation to Northern Ireland, but in relation to GB. So I think that the Commission, there will be opportunities for civil servants and experts to participate, but I think these will be constrained. In other words, it'll be very clear it's about Northern Ireland and not United Kingdom. I think the Dublin government would be, and is already, very open to any input from Northern Ireland on concerns that it can take through, because remember that it's not just the Commission matters, but also the Council. And so good relations between Belfast and Dublin would help in terms of getting perspectives that should be on the table through the entire negotiating process. And of course, Northern Ireland should also maintain links with the European Parliament. In other words, if you want to influence Brussels, you've got to be present and you've got to be there at different levels. But I think the Commission certainly learned from the fiasco of January and the potential triggering of Article 16. And so I think there is now a very significant sensitivity to not doing stuff in Brussels that hasn't been proofed in terms of the protocol. But of course, all these institutional arrangements are complex, but I would say that there certainly is an open door and a willingness to engage very much with key actors in Northern Ireland on the protocol. I think Maroš Šefčovič's his visit to Northern Ireland was to talk to people on the ground, to bring the Commission to Belfast and more widely to Northern Ireland. So I look forward with interest to that Commission paper, and I think it's something London should welcome, but it shouldn't try to use it for greater UK-London objectives. Because again, going back to what Madeleine said this morning, she said trust is very important in these relations. And I have to say that one of the impacts, unfortunately, of the Brexit process has been that particularly the Johnson government is not trusted either in Brussels, but not much trust across the capitals of the EU either. There's been a reputational damage, but also this megaphone diplomacy just, you know, it may read well with the Conservative Party and the Tory electorate, but it just doesn't translate across the continent. So I think that it's really important to focus on Northern Ireland and on the protocol and on the possibilities and opportunities that the protocol gives to Northern Ireland.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. you made a number of important points there. One of them I certainly recognise as well, and that is the need that the executive will have in the future to have a presence in Brussels and to exert influence. And certainly I had several meetings with, for example, the Swiss and the Norwegians, and I was quite impressed with the presence they have in Brussels, which they regard as being absolutely essential to ensure that their interests are recognised and understood, even though they're not in the EU. And I think that's a message for us as well. Jess, just one further question. We see that very recently Michael Gove has been given responsibility for the levelling up agenda. I'm just interested in your views on the Internal Market Act and the powers that the UK government has now taken to authorise financial assistance in the devolved space, and indeed to limit the powers of the devolved administrations in relation to regulatory standards. And, you know, I see this as being another ongoing source of tension. Any thoughts from yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, the UK government has made it clear that the kind of union is a key part of its strategy going forward. And but I think its approach to the union and to devolution, and, you know, mainly this is geared towards Scottish nationalism and the SNP kind of, I think sometimes the UK government looks at devolution through a Scottish lens and doesn't think about the consequences for places like Northern Ireland. But I think overall its approach has been to try and compete with the devolved administrations rather than cooperate with them. And its kind of main mechanism for doing that at the moment is through the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which will replace the EU funding that used to be available before Brexit. Now, previously, the devolved administrations had a very key role in deciding where that money was spent. The way that the UK government proposes to distribute this scheme in future is that decision-making will be a lot more centralised. And I think this is one of the examples where perhaps Northern Ireland was very much an afterthought, because the intention is to work with local councils in Scotland and Wales, but they're not taking that approach in Northern Ireland, and so it's a very highly centralised scheme with, you know, officials in Westminster in what has traditionally been the housing department, which has very little experience of devolution, are going to be tasked with making decisions about where funding should be spent in Northern Ireland. And I think, understandably and rightly so, there's been a lot of pushback from the Northern Ireland Executive, who are very experienced in kind of being able to distribute this funding in a way that is fair and that is sensible for the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland. I think one of the logics of moving Michael Gove to the housing department, so he now has responsibility for both the union and the Shared Prosperity Fund. I should say that the department's now been renamed to the Department of Levelling Up, which is an interesting name for a department. There is a logic to it in that Michael Gove is the person that has experience of devolution, and I think in some sense there are positives that can be brought there, in terms of he will have a better understanding of how to spend this money and how to work with the devolved administrations. He has those relationships. But when I say a better understanding than perhaps other ministers in government, but there is still quite a fractious relationship between the UK government and the Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Executive, the Scottish government, the Welsh government. So we'll have to see how it plays out, whether that was a kind of a sensible move.
Okay, thanks, Jess. We've covered a lot of ground here. I think we've probably about 5 minutes or so left. I'm sort of really keen to come back to one of the points that Pete mentioned, and that was just the impact of identity politics in Northern Ireland. I maybe wonder, Pete, if you might say a little bit more about how you see us maybe moving away from that, so that we can actually focus on tackling the really big issues, which, you know, in fact, all four speakers have actually highlighted are affecting us here.
I think to a certain extent we are moving away from it. I think once you took away violence and the extremes of the situation we lived in up until the late 90s, that does affect change. But of course the problem is, if you get points of tension, like all of us, we can all be as pluralist and liberal as we wish in our identity, but all of us have a point. Like, if you push us to a certain point, we will push and we will come out of it. But I think one of the things that's really important is what the protocol, and I think actually doing this letter was actually very instructive. There are things in the protocol which are not right. You know, somebody shouldn't be filling in 23 forms to bring something into Northern Ireland. Business people say this, okay? You know, the medicines thing, Leo Varadkar's tweet, you can just redo your supply chains in 4 months. You know, the point, the term you used earlier on with trauma, you know, the psychology of the border, etc., the psychology of health. You know, so like, you know, we all know in this room, the misfortune of getting ill doesn't fall between Protestant and Catholic. It falls, there's a flat surface that goes across us all. So so when you were doing this letter, you're getting this real pushback, because it had to be the British were at fault, and that was it. Whereas the practicalities of the protocol affect all of us. They affect what's on the shelves, they affect what medicines we have, they affect the movement, they affect the future of our children. And this was the very point in which you would have hoped that people would have looked at this and aided the discussions, the point that Jess made, by giving up what the experience was, by giving up what the evidence is about what's happening. So those things, you know, we still haven't got to that point where issues like that, which affect all of us, aren't understood in some sort of prism. Or, what we also don't know in this data fog is, I'm not sure that many people are completely exercised by the protocol to the point in which we are told that they are. And I think that's also important. And I think this is where, and it's the real politics that Bridget and Jess were talking about, this is where if we get mitigation in the next 4 to 5 weeks, okay, and the health issues solved, and whatever legal requirements are needed for that, and if the trade issues are solved, what is critically important to get beyond identity politics is finding out what the level of support in society is for that. And I would like to think the level of support for mitigations would not fall between the predictable identity politics. That we actually take what's coming out of these discussions and actually using them to change the mood. We're using them to say that there's a direction of travel, that there is progress, that there are things that are, you know, people here, drugs aren't coming into Northern Ireland. So they panic. They panic straight away. So where there are possibilities for mitigations, then this is where civic society and civic leadership comes in, which is promoting those mitigations as a conversation, which then takes this back to what 1998 was about. You didn't get perfection in what came out of it, but you were constantly listening and debating and not necessarily concluding, but finding ways to get beyond the hurdles, to get beyond the impediments. And we're in that period now, and that's what we need to go back to. We need that type of leadership of 1998. We need that way in which it is about parity of esteem and mutual respect. That's the thing that's critical here. And parity of esteem and mutual respect means we get our medicine.
Okay, we're coming up to the end. I was going to allow everybody sort of a sentence or two, and I'll be sort of strict about that. We're going into a virtual coffee break at past. Jess, just a couple of final reflections just from you.
I think more than anything, what's come out of this is the need for the UK and the EU to work together to try and find solutions on it, and to make more efforts to involve Northern Ireland civic society, Northern Ireland voices in those discussions, and use evidence to try and have proper discussions about how we can move forward and not look back. Thank you. Bridget?
I have no doubt that there are mitigations available and possible. And I think that we will see by Christmas whether or not both sides are capable of delivering that. I think that's the time frame, because Brussels certainly doesn't want what it's now calling the forever discussion on the protocol. But I think we can't hide from the structural impact of Brexit on relations between these islands, on Northern Ireland, and on relations between Belfast and Dublin and London. In my view, it is a rupture, and I think it's underestimated in London the extent to which other European capitals are absolutely amazed that any government in Europe would put the kind of pressure on the most vulnerable part of their state as Brexit has put on Northern Ireland. I have been present at Chatham House briefings where senior foreign ministry people from major European capitals are just astounded that the UK would risk the most vulnerable part of its state by pursuing a policy that so far does not appear to have brought, even for GB itself, any major benefit. So I think Brexit for me is the rupture, but it is also the reality.
Okay, Pete?
Well, what I do hope is if we get through all of this mitigation, acceptance, etc., this economy develops. I think this is the point of maturity. We go from consumption to production economy. But what I think is really important, I think we're in the territory that if we build an economy, constitutional change can be done easily, or it could be different. It could be a different arrangement than we imagine now. Or if we build that economy, constitutional change is not required at all. Because the one thing we did in the Good Friday Agreement was we didn't really build the economy that we should have built, because we were in rows and fights and identity politics. But if this is the delivery point of a new production-based economy, it will have the most profound effects on this society since partition.
Okay. The former civil servant in me would always want to leave the last word with the minister.
Thank
Nicola.
you, David. I just think we all need to stand up and stop letting the British government use Northern Ireland as a pawn in this game. But I think what's really needed here is leadership. And, you know, Pete talked about the leadership of 1998. We need leaders that aren't going to talk people into a crisis, that aren't talking them down. We need politicians and leaders that are offering hope and that have the generosity and the determination to work through the difficult issues, because we know we've faced huge problems before, and when we work together, we can get through it.
Okay. Thank you all. I think that's been a fascinating discussion. I hope our audience has enjoyed it as much as I have. I just want to thank each of you for being so constructive during the discussion, and wish you all the very, very best. Thank you. And to those watching in, I think we're now moving into a virtual coffee break. So thank you.
The Irish Government have a fantastic regional airports programme in place, fully recognising the support required to realise the benefits associated with regional connectivity. And we urgently need to seek a mechanism with all our government stakeholders which will deliver a similar operating environment. An environment in which City of Derry Airport can be supported with those associated safety and security costs to ensure a sustainable future, delivering connectivity which matches the needs and the ambitions of our entire Northwest region.
The Institute of Public Health informs public policy to support healthier populations in Ireland and Northern Ireland. Set up in 1998, the Institute is jointly funded by the Departments of Health in Ireland and Northern Ireland.